The folder struck Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's mahogany desk with sufficient force to send ripples across the surface of his coffee, displacing dark liquid onto intelligence reports that, if discovered by the Gestapo, would guarantee his execution within hours. The stains spread across coded communications from Mexico City, blurring but not obscuring the numbers that had just shattered every calculation upon which German victory depended. Unmöglich, Canaris whispered. Impossible. Through the tall windows of Abwehr headquarters on Tirpitzufer 76-78, the Landwehr Canal reflected the gray Berlin sky of March 17, 1943. 24 years earlier, in those same waters, Freikorps officers had dumped Rosa Luxemburg's body, ending one threat to German order. Now, as chief of German military intelligence, Canaris held evidence of a threat no execution could eliminate: mathematical reality. Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz stood at attention before the desk, his face carrying the expression of a man who had triple-checked calculations, hoping they would change. They hadn't. According to intercepted communications from agents operating in Mexico City, corroborated by reports from Spanish diplomatic channels and Swedish industrial observers, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan was producing one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 60 minutes. Canaris read the specification breakdown again, as if repetition might reveal an error. The B-24 Liberator, 1.5 million individual parts, 450,000 rivets, 30,000 separate components, 18 tons of aluminum, steel, rubber, and electronics, assembled into a 4-engine heavy bomber capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of ordnance across 2,000 miles. Each aircraft required 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The hydraulic systems alone contained over 300 separate components. The electrical wiring stretched for miles within each airframe. This aircraft, this flying fortress of complexity, was rolling off a single assembly line faster than Germany could produce a Kübelwagen, the simple military vehicle based on the Volkswagen chassis that required fewer than 5,000 parts and could be assembled by semi-skilled workers in less than 100 man-hours. "You have verified these numbers?" Canaris asked, though he already knew the answer. "Jawohl, Herr Admiral. 3 independent sources. The Mexican network under Georg Nicholas, the Spanish military attaché Colonel José Ungría in Washington, and Swedish businessmen who toured the facility in February. The numbers are consistent across all reports. Additionally, we have intercepted Pennsylvania Railroad manifests showing aluminum shipments to the plant, 16 million pounds monthly." Canaris performed the mental calculation: 16 million pounds of aluminum monthly. Germany's entire aluminum production in 1942 had been 234,000 metric tons, approximately 516 million pounds for the entire year. This single American factory was consuming annually what Germany produced in 4 months, and that was just one material for one plant producing one aircraft type. What neither man could articulate in that moment, what they sensed but couldn't yet comprehend, was that they were witnessing the most catastrophic intelligence failure in modern warfare. Not a failure to gather information. German intelligence networks across the Americas were functioning with remarkable efficiency, feeding Berlin accurate, detailed, independently verified reports about American industrial capacity. The failure would be one of acceptance, of belief, of the systematic inability of Nazi leadership to process intelligence that contradicted the ideological foundations upon which the entire Nazi worldview rested. The architecture of this failure had been constructed over 2 years, brick by brick, refusal by refusal. In the autumn of 1941, Luftwaffe General Karl Koller had presented Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring with meticulously detailed reports from military attaché General Friedrich von Boeticher, stationed in Washington. Von Boeticher, a career officer who had observed American industrial capacity firsthand for 3 years, reported that American aircraft production was approaching 2,000 planes monthly across all types, Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers. Göring's response had become legendary within German intelligence circles, repeated in hushed conversations among Abwehr officers who were beginning to understand they served a regime that punished accurate intelligence. Göring had laughed, not a polite chuckle of diplomatic skepticism, but a deep, rolling laugh that shook his massive frame. By 1941, Göring weighed over 260 pounds. His morphine addiction and opulent lifestyle having transformed the once lean fighter ace into a caricature of decadence. The Americans, Göring had declared to assembled Luftwaffe staff officers at Karrenhall, his vast hunting estate north of Berlin, can build refrigerators and razor blades. They make excellent automobiles for their Hollywood Jews to drive. But they cannot build military aircraft requiring precision engineering and disciplined labor. Aircraft production demands technical expertise, manufacturing discipline, and workforce quality that their mongrel democracy cannot provide. The officers present, most of whom had never visited America, never toured an American factory, never witnessed the industrial capacity that had made the United States the world's leading manufacturing nation by 1929, nodded in agreement. This assessment aligned with everything Nazi racial theory taught them. Democracy meant weakness, racial diversity meant inefficiency, Jewish influence meant corruption. These were axioms, not hypotheses open to empirical challenge. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, on December 11, 1941, at the Wolfschanze headquarters complex in East Prussia, Göring had repeated this assessment to Adolf Hitler himself. The setting was significant. Hitler's heavily fortified command bunker, surrounded by minefields and concrete barriers, deep in the forests where Teutonic knights had once fought. Here, insulated from external reality, Nazi leadership made decisions based on ideological certainty rather than empirical evidence. "The Americans are bluffing, mein Führer," Göring declared with absolute confidence. "Their democracy makes them weak. Labor unions will prevent efficient production. Their mongrel population, Negroes, Jews, immigrants, makes them inefficient. Their Jewish influence makes them corrupt at every level. They cannot possibly produce the quantities Roosevelt claims. It's propaganda designed to intimidate us." Hitler, studying maps showing German armies approaching Moscow, barely glanced at the production figures von Boedeker had compiled. The Americans required 4 years to mobilize for the last war. By the time they can bring meaningful force to bear, we will control Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Their industrial capacity, whatever it may be, becomes irrelevant if they have nowhere to deploy it. This response revealed the fundamental strategic miscalculation that would doom the Third Reich. German planning assumed American mobilization would follow the timeline of 1917 to 1918, when the United States had required 18 months to deploy meaningful military force to Europe. But in 1917, America had started from zero. No standing army, no weapons production, no military infrastructure. In 1941, Roosevelt's preparedness programs had been building that infrastructure for 2 years. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, had already transformed American industry into an arsenal for Britain and the Soviet Union 9 months before Pearl Harbor. Now, 15 months into America's declared war, the intelligence reaching Canaris's desk told a different story. Not gradual mobilization, but industrial revolution. Not eventually concerning production, but mathematically decisive output achieved in timeframes German planners had considered impossible. The reports had been building throughout 1942, each one more alarming than the last. In April 1942, agents in Detroit reported that the Ford Motor Company had broken ground on a factory complex larger than any industrial facility in Germany. In July 1942, sources in Washington, D.C. reported that Ford had received a contract for 8,685 B-24 Liberator bombers, more aircraft than Germany's entire bomber force at the start of Operation Barbarossa. In September 1942, Swedish engineer Sven Andersson traveling through Michigan on business for SKF Ball Bearing Company, filed a report with Swedish intelligence, which Swedish officers, maintaining carefully calibrated neutrality, shared with both German and Allied contacts. Anderson described witnessing construction of an aircraft assembly line over 1 mile in length, housed in a single building so vast it created its own weather patterns. The building measured 3,500 feet long, 1,280 feet wide, with a roof area of 67 acres under a single structure. Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter, head of Abwehr's Air Intelligence Section, Abteilung Air Luft, had served as Lufthansa's representative in New York during the 1920s and early 1930s. His Manhattan apartment on East 86th Street had overlooked the construction site of the Chrysler Building. Between 1928 and 1930, he had watched American construction crews erect the world's tallest building, 146 feet, 77 floors, in 19 months, completing it ahead of schedule and under budget, despite the 1929 stock market crash. He remembered standing on the sidewalk in May 1930, watching the final steel beam hoisted into place, amazed at the speed and efficiency. American construction crews worked with precision that rivaled German engineering, but at speeds German projects never achieved. The Chrysler Building had required 391,881 rivets, 3,126,000 bricks, and 20,961 tons of structural steel, all assembled by crews working in coordinated shifts that never stopped, day or night, through rain, snow, and the collapse of the American economy. That experience informed Ritter's analysis of the Willow Run intelligence in ways his colleagues, who had never witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand, couldn't fully grasp. When Swedish reports described Ford constructing a mile-long assembly line in 16 months, Ritter didn't dismiss it as impossible. He understood Americans possessed organizational capabilities and construction speeds that defied European assumptions. His memorandum to Canaris, dated March 12, 1943, carried the weight of professional assessment stripped of ideological comfort. Herr Admiral, I have analyzed 17 independent intelligence reports regarding the Ford Willow Run facility. The reports show remarkable consistency across sources with no opportunity for coordination. Mexican agents, Spanish diplomats, Swedish businessmen, intercepted American correspondence, even signals intelligence showing electrical power consumption. The convergence of independent sources on identical conclusions suggests accuracy rather than deception. Ritter continued with mathematical precision. If Ford is indeed producing one B-24 every 60 minutes at sustained rates, this represents 16 aircraft daily, 112 weekly, approximately 480 monthly. This single facility would produce more heavy bombers monthly than Germany's entire aircraft industry produces across all types. Herr Admiral, if these production numbers are correct, and I believe they are, then Germany has already lost the war. It is now only a question of mathematics and time. Canaris had read that assessment 6 days before the folder landed on his desk. Now, with the latest intelligence from Mexico City confirming everything Ritter had analyzed, the admiral faced a crisis that transcended military intelligence. He was confronting the collapse of an entire worldview. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on certain foundational claims: that Aryan racial purity produced superior organizational capacity, that authoritarian discipline outperformed democratic chaos, that German technical excellence exceeded all competitors, that the Führer's strategic vision was infallible. Every one of these claims faced empirical refutation in the intelligence reports covering Canaris's desk. The Ford Willow Run plant employed 42,000 workers at peak production. German intelligence had obtained detailed workforce demographics through multiple sources. The numbers demolished Nazi racial theory. 11,000 women comprised 26% of the workforce, performing tasks German doctrine insisted only men could handle: riveting, welding, hydraulic system installation, electrical wiring. These weren't simple assembly tasks. Installing the B-24's complex hydraulic systems required understanding pressure flows, valve sequences, and emergency backup systems. Women with high school educations were mastering these tasks in weeks. 3,800 African Americans comprised 9% of the workforce, operating sophisticated machine tools, managing logistics, performing precision metalwork. Nazi racial theory placed African Americans at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, capable only of manual labor under supervision. Yet here they were operating turret lathes, milling machines, and precision drilling equipment, producing parts with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. 1,200 disabled workers comprised 3% of the workforce. Men with missing limbs, vision impairments, hearing loss, workers German eugenics programs would have sterilized or eliminated, were performing essential production tasks, adapted specifically to their capabilities. This demographic reality posed an existential threat to Nazi ideology more dangerous than any military defeat. If inferior races and weaker specimens could outproduce the Aryan master race by orders of magnitude, what validity did racial theory retain? If American democracy's chaotic labor relations could organize 42,000 workers more efficiently than German authoritarian discipline could organize its entire aircraft industry, what superiority did the fascist model possess? Canaris lit a cigarette, his third of the morning, and watched smoke curl toward the ceiling of his office. Outside his windows, Berlin continued its routines. Streetcars rattled along Tirpitzufer. Workers hurried through March cold toward government offices. Luftwaffe officers crossed the Landwehr Canal bridges toward Air Ministry headquarters on Leipziger Strasse. The machinery of the Third Reich functioned with its characteristic precision and brutality, unaware that within this office, two intelligence professionals were contemplating mathematical proof of its inevitable defeat. Herr Mayer, Canaris said quietly, prepare a comprehensive briefing. Include all source materials, technical specifications, independent confirmations, photographic evidence if available. I will present this to Reichsmarschall Göring within the week. Heinz's expression revealed his thoughts without words. You are going to tell Göring he was wrong? You are going to present evidence that contradicts the Führer's strategic assumptions? You understand this could mean Flossenburg concentration camp? Jawohl, Herr Admiral, Heinz said simply, because in the Abwehr, under Canaris's command, intelligence officers still believed, naively, fatally, that accurate intelligence mattered more than comfortable lies. What Canaris didn't yet know was that the intelligence regarding Willow Run represented only the visible portion of American industrial transformation. The B-24 production was dramatic, quantifiable, and therefore reportable through intelligence channels. But beneath that visible production lay systemic changes in American manufacturing that German intelligence couldn't fully capture because they exceeded the conceptual frameworks German officers possessed. Ford hadn't just built a factory. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief and architect of the Willow Run system, had deconstructed the entire concept of aircraft manufacturing and rebuilt it from first principles. Traditional aircraft production, the method consolidated aircraft used at its San Diego plant, treated each aircraft as a unique construction project. Skilled craftsmen swarmed over stationary airframes, custom-fitting parts, hand-filing components to fit, solving problems through expertise and experience. Consolidated's San Diego plant produced one B-24 every 180,000 man-hours using this method. Sorensen had spent one night in his San Diego hotel room in 1940 sketching a completely different approach. Instead of skilled workers adapting to unique aircraft, he would standardize aircraft so unskilled workers could perform repetitive tasks. Instead of workers moving to stationary aircraft, aircraft would move past stationary workers. Instead of craftsmen solving problems through expertise, engineers would eliminate problems through standardization. He had broken the B-24 down into 60,000 separate manufacturing operations, each simple enough that workers could learn it in hours or days rather than months or years. A woman who had been making breakfast for her children the previous week could install hydraulic lines in tail sections after 3 days of training, not because the task was simplified, but because it was isolated, standardized, and repeated until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. This approach violated everything European aircraft manufacturers believed about quality. German aircraft production relied on skilled craftsmen, multi-year apprenticeships, engineering expertise applied at every production stage. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's primary fighter, required 5,000 man-hours to produce using highly skilled labor. The concept that semi-skilled workers performing simple repetitive tasks could produce quality aircraft seemed absurd. Yet by March 1943, Willow Run was doing exactly that. Quality control inspections showed defect rates declining even as production speeds increased. The assembly line's mechanical precision eliminated human error. Standardized parts meant perfect fits without hand filing. Specialized tooling meant consistent quality regardless of worker skill level. German intelligence officers analyzing this data recognized they were observing something unprecedented: the complete industrialization of complex manufacturing. Henry Ford had transformed bomber production from a craft to an industrial process, from art to science, from skilled labor to systematic organization. And if Ford could industrialize bomber production, what else could American industry systematically transform? Tank production, ship construction, artillery manufacturing? Once the principles of standardization, specialized tooling, and moving assembly lines were applied, traditional calculations of production capacity became obsolete. This was the deeper intelligence failure Canaris couldn't yet articulate. German planning assumed American production would follow European models, achieving European-level efficiency with American-scale resources. But Americans weren't scaling European methods. They were inventing entirely new manufacturing paradigms that rendered European assumptions irrelevant. The March 1943 intelligence represented a threshold moment. Before this, German skepticism about American production claims could be rationalized as reasonable doubt pending confirmation. After this, with 17 independent sources confirming identical data, skepticism became willful denial. Canaris stubbed out his cigarette and began organizing the briefing materials. He understood he was about to challenge not just Göring's judgment, but the entire ideological foundation of Nazi Germany's strategic calculations. He was going to present mathematical evidence that democracy worked, that diversity strengthened, that freedom produced, that American industrial capacity exceeded German capacity by orders of magnitude. He was going to tell the Nazi leadership that they had started a war they could not win, that the inferiority they attributed to American society was projection masking their own systemic weaknesses, that ideology could not overcome mathematics. Canaris was going to tell the truth, and in Nazi Germany, truth had become the most dangerous act imaginable. The intelligence arrived through channels so diverse, so independent, and so consistent that dismissing it required willful blindness approaching psychological disorder. Throughout the spring of 1943, German intelligence networks across 3 continents, operating without coordination, serving different masters, pursuing separate objectives, reported the same impossible reality. American industrial capacity had transcended every historical precedent for manufacturing scale and speed. On the evening of February 3, 1943, in the ballroom of the German-Mexican Commerce Association on Avenida Juarez in Mexico City, American oil executive Harold Morrison attended a reception celebrating strengthened commercial ties between Mexican petroleum interests and neutral business partners. Morrison, a 52-year-old vice president of Continental Oil Company, had spent the previous week touring Mexican refineries outside Tampico. He had flown to Mexico City for 2 days of meetings before returning to his home office in Ponca City, Oklahoma. The reception was attended by approximately 60 businessmen, Mexican oil executives, Argentine leather merchants, Spanish import-export traders, Swedish industrial representatives, and various other commercial figures operating in the gray zones of wartime commerce. Among them, appearing in the guest register as Ricardo Wolf, representative of an Argentine leather concern, was Wolfgang Blau, a 38-year-old Abwehr agent who had operated in Mexico City since 1940 under commercial cover. Blau's mission parameters were straightforward: cultivate American businessmen traveling through Mexico, encourage conversation through hospitality and alcohol, extract intelligence regarding U.S. industrial production, war material output, and economic mobilization. His success rate had been remarkable. American executives, operating in what they perceived as neutral territory, spoke freely after several drinks about subjects they would never discuss within the United States, where FBI counterintelligence and Office of Censorship monitored such conversations aggressively. Morrison proved particularly forthcoming. After 3 tequilas, Blau was carefully counting, the oil executive began describing his recent tour of the Ford Willow Run facility outside Detroit, arranged by Ford Motor Company to showcase to potential investors the corporation's capability to fulfill massive government contracts. Ford was positioning itself for post-war commercial opportunities and wanted oil industry executives to understand the company's manufacturing sophistication. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his Oklahoma accent thickening with alcohol, his voice carrying across the small group that had gathered around him. "What I witnessed at Willow Run defies description. I've toured refineries across Texas, Oklahoma, California. I've seen Standard Oil's Bayonne complex, which covers 1,500 acres. I thought I understood industrial scale. But Willow Run operates on a level that makes our largest refineries look like corner grocery stores." Blau leaned in, his expression carefully calibrated to show casual interest rather than intense focus. "I've read about this plant in newspapers, but surely the reports are exaggerated for propaganda purposes." Morrison laughed, shaking his head with the emphatic certainty of someone who had seen something that challenged his own assumptions. "I thought exactly that. I assumed Ford was showing us mock-ups, propaganda displays, but Ricardo," he addressed Blau by his cover name, "they gave us complete access. We walked the entire assembly line. We watched bombers being built in real time." He pulled a pencil from his jacket pocket and grabbed a cocktail napkin, beginning to sketch with the precise hand movements of an engineer accustomed to technical drawings. The small group pressed closer. Mexican executives, Spanish traders, Swedish representatives, all appearing to share casual curiosity, while Blau memorized every detail Morrison described. "The building itself is almost incomprehensible," Morrison continued, his pencil moving across the napkin. "It measures 67 acres under a single roof. The assembly line runs over 1 mile in length. The structure is so vast that weather forms inside it. Clouds actually form near the ceiling when temperature differentials are significant. Workers have reported seeing rain inside the factory." A Mexican executive interrupted with polite skepticism. "Senor Morrison, surely you're exaggerating for dramatic effect." "I wish I were," Morrison replied. The building required 27,000 tons of structural steel, more steel than many warships. The electrical systems consume 2.5 million kilowatt-hours monthly. That's enough electricity to power a city of 100,000 people, just for one factory. Blau asked the question his training demanded. "But what are they actually producing? Surely such scale doesn't translate to actual output." Morrison's expression shifted to something approaching awe. "They're producing 1 complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak efficiency, they've achieved rates of 1 aircraft every 55 minutes. I watched the process for 6 hours. Every hour, a completed bomber, fully assembled, all systems installed, rolled off the end of that line." He began sketching the aircraft's basic configuration on the napkin. "The B-24 Liberator is not a simple machine. It has 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines, each producing 200 horsepower. 2 bomb bays, each capable of holding 4,000 pounds of ordnance, 8,000 pounds total payload. The aircraft weighs 36,000 pounds empty, 65,000 pounds fully loaded. It contains 1.5 million individual parts, 450,000 rivets, 30,000 separate components. A Swedish businessman, Erik Lundberg, representing SKF ball-bearing interests, asked with genuine technical interest, "How do they achieve such production rates with such complexity?" Morrison gestured expansively, warming to his subject. Ford broke the bomber down into what they call sub-assemblies. The aircraft isn't built in one location. Wing sections are manufactured in one part of the plant, fuselages in another, tail assemblies in a third section, engine nacelles in a fourth. These sub-assemblies converge like rivers flowing into the sea. That's how their production chief described it to us. He sketched converging lines on the napkin. Wing sections arrive from the west side of the plant, fuselages from the center, tail assemblies from the east. They meet at precise points along the main assembly line. The timing has to be exact. If wing sections arrive 3 minutes late, the entire line backs up. But they've engineered the process so precisely that delays are rare. Blau pressed for the details his controllers in Berlin would demand. But surely this requires highly skilled labor? Specialized craftsmen? Morrison shook his head emphatically. That's what's most remarkable. Ford has 42,000 workers at Willow Run, but most have no aircraft manufacturing experience. They hire women who were housewives 2 months ago. They hire Negro workers who were sharecroppers or domestic servants. They hire teenagers, disabled workers, anyone who can perform simple, repetitive tasks. He paused for another drink, then continued. They've broken each job down into simple, repeatable operations. A woman who yesterday was making breakfast for her children now installs hydraulic lines in the tail section. They train her in 3 days, not 3 months. She doesn't need to understand the entire aircraft. She needs to understand one specific task: connecting hydraulic line A to junction point B, torquing the fitting to exact specification, checking for leaks. She performs that task 200 times per day, every day. After a week, she can do it without thinking. Faster and more accurately than craftsmen who understand the entire system. The implications were staggering, and Blau recognized that Morrison himself seemed overwhelmed by what he had witnessed. This wasn't propaganda. This was an American businessman, operating in what he believed was neutral territory, describing something that had fundamentally challenged his understanding of industrial capability. They have an apprentice school, Morrison continued, that trains 8,000 workers weekly. Not monthly, weekly. Workers cycle through 3-day to 2-week training programs depending on task complexity, then go directly to the production line. The school operates in 3 shifts, 24 hours daily. They're creating a workforce at speeds that would have been considered impossible 5 years ago. A Spanish trader asked, "But quality must suffer, producing so quickly with inexperienced workers?" Morrison laughed. "That's what Consolidated Aircraft said. Consolidated builds B-24s at their San Diego plant using traditional methods. Skilled craftsmen, custom fitting, hand-filing components. They mocked Ford, said you can't build aircraft like automobiles. But Ford's defect rates are actually lower than Consolidated's. The standardization eliminates human error. Every part fits exactly because it's machined to precise specifications. There's no hand-filing, no custom adjustments. If a part doesn't fit, it's rejected and replaced, not modified." He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly, though not enough to prevent Blau from hearing clearly. "Gentlemen, I'll tell you something Ford's production chief told us privately. Charles Sorensen, he's the genius behind the entire system. He said that when he first visited Consolidated's San Diego plant in 1940, they were building B-24s outdoors, in the California sunshine, each aircraft taking 180,000 man-hours to complete. He spent one night in his hotel room sketching a different approach. One night, he redesigned the entire production process, breaking it down into 60,000 separate operations, each simple enough that minimally trained workers could master it quickly. Blau asked, careful to maintain his cover as a leather merchant with only casual interest. But doesn't this approach require enormous capital investment? Specialized tools? Absolutely, Morrison confirmed. Ford spent $200 million building Willow Run, the plant, the tooling, the infrastructure. They use 1,600 specialized machine tools, many designed for single operations. Most of those tools were custom-built. The capital investment is staggering. But once that investment is made, the production costs per aircraft drop dramatically. Consolidated spends about $238,000 per B-24 using traditional methods. Ford's cost has dropped to $137,000 and continues falling as production volume increases. The Mexican executive did quick mental arithmetic. If Ford produces 500 aircraft monthly at $100,000 savings each, that's $50 million monthly in cost advantages. The plant pays for itself in 4 months. Exactly, Morrison said. And that's just one plant, one aircraft type. Ford is applying these methods to other military products. The entire American industrial base is being transformed. What we're witnessing isn't just wartime production, it's the complete reinvention of manufacturing. Through similar channels, different agents, different targets, different circumstances. German intelligence received corroborating reports throughout the spring of 1943. Each source added layers of detail that reinforced rather than contradicted the others. Colonel José Ungría, Spanish military attaché in Washington, maintained extensive contacts with American aircraft manufacturers. Spain's carefully calibrated neutrality, leaning toward the Axis ideologically while trading with both sides commercially, gave Spanish diplomats unusual access to American industrial facilities. Aircraft manufacturers viewed Spain as a potential post-war customer and cultivated Spanish military representatives accordingly. In March 1943, Ungría attended a reception at the Argentine embassy in Washington, one of dozens of diplomatic gatherings that constituted the social machinery through which neutral nations maintained relationships with all belligerents. Among the attendees was Charles Sorensen, Ford's 61-year-old production chief and the architect of the Willow Run system. Sorensen, believing he was speaking to a representative of a neutral nation that might purchase American aircraft after the war ended, spoke freely about the plant's capabilities and the revolutionary production methods Ford had pioneered. What Sorensen didn't know, or chose not to acknowledge, was that every word would be encoded and transmitted to Berlin within 2 weeks through Spanish diplomatic channels. "Colonel," Sorensen said, standing near the embassy's grand windows overlooking Massachusetts Avenue. "When I first visited Consolidated's San Diego plant in 1940, I was appalled. They were building B-24s outdoors in the California sunshine, each aircraft different from the last, taking 180,000 man-hours per unit. Workers swarmed over stationary airframes like ants on a carcass. There was no system, no flow, no efficiency. I knew immediately we could do better." Ungría, an engineer by training who had graduated from Spain's General Military Academy before its closure during the Civil War, pressed for technical details with questions that seemed professionally curious rather than intelligence-focused. "But surely aircraft are too complex for automobile production methods. The precision requirements, the system integration." Sorensen smiled with the confidence of someone who had been proven correct against universal skepticism. "Everyone said that. Consolidated said it. The Army Air Forces said it. Even Henry Ford was skeptical initially. But I spent one night in my hotel room in San Diego sketching out the entire production flow. One night, I broke the problem down from first principles." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He habitually carried notebooks, filling them with sketches and calculations. and began drawing a simplified diagram. Traditional aircraft production treats each plane as a unique construction project. You build it in one location, workers swarm around it. Skilled craftsmen custom fit everything. It's medieval guild methodology applied to 20th century technology. His pencil moved quickly, sketching converging lines. I inverted the entire concept. Instead of workers moving to a stationary aircraft, the aircraft moves past stationary workers. Instead of skilled craftsmen adapting to unique circumstances, we standardize components so semi-skilled workers can perform repetitive tasks. Instead of custom fitting each part, we machine parts to specifications so precise that they're interchangeable without modification. Hungria studied the sketch with genuine interest. But how do you achieve the necessary precision with semi-skilled labor? We don't rely on labor for precision, Sorensen explained. We rely on tooling. We invested $200 million in specialized machine tools. Each tool is designed for specific operations, programmed, if you will, to produce parts within tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A worker with 3 days of training can operate a turret lathe that produces crankshaft housings more precisely than a master machinist with 30 years of experience working manually. He warmed to his subject, clearly proud of achievements that had vindicated his vision against widespread skepticism. We broke the B-24 into 60,000 separate manufacturing operations. Most are simple enough that workers can master them in hours or days. Installing a hydraulic line, torquing fittings to specification, riveting a panel seam. These aren't complex tasks individually. The complexity is in the orchestration, not the execution. And your workforce? Hungria asked. Surely you require extensive experience? Sorensen laughed. We built an apprentice school that trains 8,000 workers weekly, not experienced aircraft workers, housewives, farm workers, domestic servants, anyone capable of following instructions and performing repetitive tasks. Women comprise 40% of our workforce. They're actually superior for certain operations. Smaller hands for tight spaces, greater patience for repetitive precision work, lower turnover rates. This demographic information, carefully recorded by Hungria in his diplomatic reports, would prove particularly devastating when it reached Berlin. Nazi ideology insisted that women were intellectually and physically incapable of industrial work requiring precision and technical understanding. Yet here was America's most successful production manager stating explicitly that women performed superior to men in certain technical operations. We have Negro workers operating sophisticated machinery, Sorensen continued, unaware that this statement would challenge another foundational element of Nazi racial theory. They operate turret lathes, milling machines, precision drilling equipment. With proper training and appropriate tooling, capability isn't determined by race or gender. It's determined by whether the production process is designed for human capability rather than requiring superhuman expertise. Hungria's report to Madrid, subsequently shared with Berlin through Spanish intelligence channels, included verbatim quotes and technical specifications. But more significantly, it included Hungria's analytical assessment. The Americans have achieved something unprecedented in manufacturing history. They have industrialized complexity. What implications this holds for post-war commercial competition should concern every European nation. What implications it holds for current military production should terrify Germany. Independent verification came from unexpected sources. Swedish engineer Erik Lundberg, traveling through Detroit in March 1943 on business for SKF ball-bearing interests, obtained permission to tour Willow Run through Ford's commercial relationships with Swedish industry. Sweden maintained trade relationships with both Allied and Axis powers. And American manufacturers cultivated Swedish contacts, anticipating post-war European reconstruction. Lundberg's technical report, filed with SKF's Stockholm headquarters and subsequently shared with Swedish military intelligence, which maintained careful neutrality by sharing intelligence with both sides, provided detailed analysis that confirmed every aspect of the Ford production system. The scale exceeds European comprehension, Lundberg wrote. The main assembly building measures 3,500 feet in length, housing an assembly line over 1 mile long. The structure requires its own power plant, generating 2.5 million kilowatt-hours monthly. The capital investment, approximately $200 million, exceeds the total value of Sweden's entire ball bearing industry. His technical analysis focused on the production methods. Ford has achieved what European manufacturers consider impossible: the complete standardization of a complex, multi-system machine. Every B-24 produced at Willow Run is identical to every other at the component level. This standardization required extraordinary engineering investment, designing specialized tooling, developing precision manufacturing processes, creating quality control systems that verify tolerances across 30,000 components per aircraft. Most significantly, Lundberg analyzed the workforce composition. The plant employs 42,000 workers across 3 shifts. Approximately 40% are women with no previous industrial experience. Training programs range from 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on task complexity. The Americans have proven that with appropriate tooling and process design, complex manufacturing doesn't require extensive expertise. It requires systematic organization and capital investment in specialized equipment. Even more alarming for German intelligence were intercepted Japanese communications. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Japanese naval attaché in Washington, sent coded messages to Tokyo throughout early 1943 describing American industrial capacity. German signals intelligence, Operating Station Solomon in occupied France, intercepted and decoded many of these transmissions. Omi's assessment, transmitted March 15, 1943. This single factory produces more aircraft monthly than entire Japanese aviation industry. American industrial capacity exceeds all previous estimates by factors we cannot calculate accurately. Strategic planning based on attrition assumptions no longer valid. Americans replace losses faster than we can inflict them. By April 1943, German intelligence possessed 17 independent reports from uncoordinated sources. Mexican agents, Spanish diplomats, Swedish businessmen intercepted Japanese communications, Turkish commercial travelers, Argentine trade representatives, even censored letters from German-American workers to relatives in neutral countries that postal censors had copied before delivery. Every source reported the same data: 1 B-24 Liberator every 60 minutes. 42,000 workers. 40% women, significant African-American workforce, training programs measured in days, not months. Peak production approaching 500 aircraft monthly from a single plant. The convergence of independent sources on identical conclusions eliminated any possibility of coordinated deception. The intelligence was accurate. The question wasn't whether Americans had achieved these production rates. The question was whether German leadership would believe it. On April 20, 1943, Adolf Hitler's 54th birthday, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris drove through the forests north of Berlin toward Carenhall, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's vast hunting estate. The leather briefcase on the seat beside him contained 17 intelligence reports, 12 photographs, intercepted railroad manifests documenting aluminum shipments, transcribed conversations from 3 continents, and aerial reconnaissance imagery obtained through neutral Swedish channels. The evidence was comprehensive, independently verified, and mathematically irrefutable. Canaris understood he was about to commit professional suicide. Carenhall sprawled across 100,000 acres of pine forest and hunting grounds, a monument to Göring's ego and corruption. The main residence, completed in 1939, contained 60 rooms decorated with artwork looted from across conquered Europe. Göring had named the estate after his first wife, Karen, and constructed it as a deliberate echo of Teutonic grandeur. Massive timber beams, hunting trophies covering entire walls, Renaissance paintings worth millions of Reichsmarks hanging beside medieval tapestries. The Reichsmarschall received Canaris in his trophy room, a cavernous space dominated by stuffed animals Göring had shot across Europe and Africa. A Bengal tiger occupied the room's center, frozen in mid-leap. European bison flanked the fireplace. Above the mantel hung a portrait of Göring in his Pour le Mérite uniform from the Great War, when he had been lean, dangerous, and genuinely heroic as commander of the Richthofen squadron. The man who greeted Canaris bore little resemblance to that warrior. By April 1943, Göring weighed over 280 pounds. His morphine addiction had progressed to the point where he required injections every 4 hours, and his grasp of Luftwaffe operations had deteriorated into fantasy disconnected from battlefield reality. He wore a white uniform of his own design, somewhere between a Roman toga and a Renaissance prince's garb, festooned with medals, many of which he had awarded himself. "Canaris!" Göring boomed, gesturing toward a massive oak table where hunting maps usually lay spread. "You bring me intelligence on the Führer's birthday? I hope it's good news. We need victories to celebrate." Canaris opened his briefcase with the careful movements of a man handling explosives. "Herr Reichsmarschall, I must present intelligence regarding American aircraft production that requires immediate strategic reassessment." He spread the photographs across the table, aerial reconnaissance images of Willow Run taken by a Spanish diplomat flying a commercial route past Detroit. The images showed the massive structure, parking lots filled with thousands of workers' automobiles, completed B-24s visible at the adjacent airfield, railroad sidings crowded with freight cars delivering materials. Göring picked up one photograph, studying it with the practiced eye of a former pilot who understood aerial reconnaissance. For a moment, Canaris hoped the Reichsmarschall's professional instincts might override his ideological certainty. "This is the Ford Willow Run plant," Canaris explained. "We have confirmation from 17 independent sources that this facility is producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 60 minutes. At peak efficiency, they've achieved rates of one aircraft every 55 minutes. Monthly production from this single plant exceeds 450 aircraft." Göring set down the photograph and laughed. Not a polite chuckle of diplomatic skepticism, but a deep, rumbling laugh that shook his massive frame and echoed off the trophy room's vaulted ceiling. "Canaris, do you take me for a fool?" The Admiral had anticipated this reaction, but experiencing it directly felt like falling into cold water. "Herr Reichsmarschall, these are independently verified." "They're wooden mock-ups," Göring interrupted, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Propaganda props. The Americans want us to believe they can build aircraft like sausages from a machine. This Willow Run plant probably produces 50 bombers monthly at most, perhaps fewer. These photographs show propaganda displays designed to intimidate us and mislead our intelligence services." Canaris pulled out another document, intercepted manifests from the Pennsylvania Railroad showing aluminum shipments to Willow Run. "Herr Reichsmarschall, they're consuming 16 million pounds of aluminum monthly at this single plant. That's more than our entire national monthly production. The railroad manifests are genuine. We've verified them through multiple. Then where do they get this aluminum?" Göring's voice rose with theatrical incredulity. "From their Negro workers? From their women riveters?" "Canaris, you've been deceived by American propaganda. They produce aluminum for refrigerators and cooking pots. They cannot possibly produce the quantities required for such aircraft production." The Admiral tried a different approach, pulling out transcribed reports from Spanish military attaché Colonel José Ungria's conversations with Ford production chief Charles Sorensen. "We have detailed technical descriptions of their production methods. They've broken the bomber down into 60,000 separate operations. They've invested $200 million in specialized tooling. They train workers in days rather than months because each worker performs simple, repetitive tasks. Impossible, Göring declared flatly. A bomber is not an automobile. It requires precision engineering, skilled labor, technical expertise. The B-24 contains complex hydraulic systems, sophisticated electrical networks, precision machined components. You cannot train housewives and farmhands to build such aircraft in days. It requires years of apprenticeship, technical education, mechanical aptitude that their mongrel democracy cannot provide. Canaris felt the conversation collapsing, but pressed forward, driven by professional duty that overrode survival instinct. Herr Reichsmarschall, we have reports from Swedish engineers who toured the facility. We have intercepted Japanese naval intelligence confirming these production rates. We have... Enough! Göring cut him off with imperial finality. I've read these reports, Canaris. I understand what you're trying to tell me. But I also understand American character and capability. I lived in Sweden after the war. Göring had spent 4 years in exile in Sweden after the 1923 beer hall putsch. And I observed Americans there. They're loud, undisciplined, incapable of the focus required for complex manufacturing. Their democracy makes them weak. Labor unions prevent efficiency. Their racial mixing creates workforce chaos. The Reichsmarschall walked to the window, looking out over his vast estate, his back to Canaris. The Americans entered this war in December 1941, 16 months ago. You're telling me they designed a factory, constructed it, developed specialized tooling, trained tens of thousands of workers, and achieved production rates exceeding our entire industry in 16 months. It's absurd on its face. Canaris made one final attempt. Herr Reichsmarschall, what if the intelligence is accurate? What strategic adjustments would be required if... Göring spun around, his face flushed with anger or morphine or both. The intelligence is false, Admiral. Your agents have been deceived or have become defeatists. I will not bring such demoralizing propaganda to the Führer's attention on his birthday. We are preparing for Operation Citadel, the massive offensive against the Kursk salient scheduled for July. And I will not undermine German confidence with American fantasy stories. The meeting ended. Canaris gathered his materials with mechanical precision, understanding that he had just witnessed something more dangerous than military defeat. The complete rejection of reality by leadership insulated from consequence through ideology and rank. 7 days later, on April 27, 1943, Canaris received a summons to the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters complex in East Prussia. The summons specified he would brief the Führer personally on American industrial capacity. Present would be General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff, and Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda. The Wolfschanze sprawled across 6.5 square kilometers of forest near Rustenburg, protected by minefields, concrete barriers, anti-aircraft batteries, and 3 security perimeters. The innermost compound, Sperrkreis I, contained Hitler's personal bunker, conference rooms, and living quarters. The complex was designed to be impregnable from external attack. What it actually created was an echo chamber where ideology could flourish undisturbed by external reality. Canaris arrived on April 29th, carrying the same briefcase of intelligence he had presented to Göring. He had added one additional element: calculations prepared by Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter, showing what American production rates meant for the strategic balance of air power over Europe. The briefing room in Hitler's compound was austere compared to Karenhall's opulence. Concrete walls, a large map table displaying the Eastern Front, where Operation Citadel preparations consumed German attention, overhead lighting that cast harsh shadows. Hitler stood at the map table when Canaris entered, studying the Kursk salient with Generals Keitel and Jodl. Goebbels sat to one side, reviewing documents. Herr Admiral, Hitler said without preamble, not looking up from the maps. Reichsmarshal Göring tells me you've received intelligence regarding American aircraft production that you believe requires my attention. Present your information. Canaris spread his materials across a secondary table. Photographs, transcripts, manifests, technical specifications. He began with the most conservative presentation of the data, hoping that careful presentation might overcome ideological resistance. Mein Führer, German intelligence networks across the Americas have obtained consistent reports regarding the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility in Michigan. 17 independent sources, operating without coordination, report that this plant is producing B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at rates significantly exceeding previous estimates of American capacity. Hitler glanced at the photographs briefly, then returned his attention to the Eastern Front maps. What rates? 1 aircraft per hour, Mein Führer. Sustained production of approximately 450 to 500 aircraft monthly from this single facility. Now Hitler looked directly at Canaris, his pale blue eyes showing not concern but irritation at having his strategic planning interrupted. 1 aircraft per hour? The B-24 requires how many components? Approximately 1.5 million individual parts, Mein Führer. The aircraft weighs... So the Americans claim, Hitler interrupted, to have achieved production in 16 months that required us 6 years to prepare. They claim to have designed, constructed, and operationalized a factory producing complex multi-engine bombers at rates exceeding our entire industry. Herr Admiral, how long did it take us to build the Messerschmitt facilities at Regensburg? Canaris knew the answer would doom his briefing. Approximately 3 years, Mein Führer, from initial planning to full production. 3 years to build facilities producing single-engine fighters, Hitler said, with the tone of a professor correcting a slow student. Yet the Americans built a facility producing 4-engine heavy bombers in less than half that time, and achieved production rates we've never approached. It's propaganda, Admiral. Obvious propaganda. General Jodl studied the intelligence materials more carefully than Hitler had. His engineer's training making him uncomfortable with dismissing technical data. Mein Führer, if we accept even 1/4 of these production figures as accurate, the implications for strategic air defense are... The figures are false, Hitler interrupted with finality. The Americans entered the war in December 1941. Building this miraculous factory and achieving this production in such time is impossible. It violates every principle of industrial development and workforce training. Canaris pulled out the transcripts of Charles Sorensen's detailed explanations of Ford's production methods, the breakdown into 60,000 operations, the specialized tooling, the training programs producing 8,000 workers weekly. Mein Führer, they've developed new manufacturing methodologies that... New methodologies, Goebbels interjected, speaking for the first time, his voice carrying the practiced skepticism of a professional propagandist. The Americans are brilliant propagandists. I'll grant them that. Hollywood has taught them how to create convincing illusions. These production claims are designed to demoralize German forces and mislead our strategic planning. The actual numbers are probably 1/10 of what they claim. Hitler nodded in agreement. Dr. Goebbels is correct. The Americans understand propaganda. They're attempting to win through psychological warfare what they cannot win through actual production. Their democracy prevents the coordination required for such industrial achievement. Their racial diversity prevents the workforce quality necessary. Their Jewish influence corrupts every institution. Canaris made one final attempt, knowing it was futile but unable to abandon professional duty. Mein Führer, if the intelligence is even partially accurate, it suggests we should prioritize fighter production for defensive operations rather than continuing bomber production for... Admiral! Hitler's voice dropped to the quiet tone that terrified his subordinates more than shouting. I am preparing the largest armored offensive in military history. Operation Citadel will destroy Soviet forces at Kursk and restore German initiative on the Eastern Front. I am considering our strategy for Mediterranean operations following the North African situation. I am managing a continental war across multiple fronts. I will not divert my attention to American propaganda about impossible production rates. He turned back to the Eastern Front maps, dismissing Canaris through the simple act of ignoring him. Your agents have been deceived, or they've become defeatists. Either way, I will not adjust German strategy based on fantasies. The Americans produce refrigerators competently. They cannot produce bombers at rates exceeding our industry. Dismissed. The briefing had lasted 11 minutes. Canaris gathered his materials in silence and left the compound, understanding with absolute clarity that German leadership could not, accept intelligence that contradicted their worldview. The Nazi regime had constructed its legitimacy on specific ideological premises: Aryan superiority, authoritarian efficiency, the weakness of democracy, the inferiority of mixed-race societies. Accepting that American democracy had outproduced German authoritarianism by orders of magnitude would require abandoning those foundational premises. What Canaris didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that hidden within the Abwehr's own headquarters, his deputy Hans Oster had taken a far more desperate step. Oster had obtained film footage of Willow Run in operation, smuggled through American intelligence contacts in Switzerland via Spanish diplomatic pouches. 5 minutes of 16mm film showing the assembly line in full operation, B-24s in every stage of construction, moving past at steady pace, workers performing tasks with mechanical precision, a wall clock visible in several shots confirming the timing. On May 3, 1943, in a locked room in Abwehr headquarters on Tirpitzufer, Canaris and Oster watched the film using a small projector Oster had acquired through black market channels. The camera work was professional, probably U.S. Army Signal Corps footage, traveling along the entire mile-long assembly line. The images were undeniable. Wing sections converging from one direction, fuselages from another, tail assemblies from a third. Workers, men and women, white and black, performing tasks with practiced efficiency. Completed bombers rolling off the line's terminus, engines being tested, aircraft being towed to the adjacent airfield. Mein Gott, Oster whispered as the film played. It's all true. Every report, every claim. They're actually doing it. Canaris sat in silence, watching proof that should have changed everything, but would change nothing. The film ended, the projector's bulb casting harsh white light against the blank screen. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Oster asked, "Do we show this to them? To Göring? To the Führer?" Canaris pulled out his cigarette lighter, flicking it open with mechanical precision. What would happen if we showed this footage to Reichsmarschall Göring? He would either dismiss it as clever propaganda, American photographic trickery using scale models, or he would accuse us of creating fake footage ourselves, of treason, of defeatism designed to undermine German morale. Oster's voice carried the flat tone of a man stating obvious facts. And if we somehow convinced them it was genuine, they would have us arrested, probably executed. Truth has become treasonous, Wilhelm. We're intelligence officers serving a regime that punishes accurate intelligence. Canaris held his lighter's flame to the film, watching celluloid begin to curl and burn. The images of Willow Run's assembly line blackened and dissolved, releasing acrid chemical smoke. Within minutes, the only visual proof of American production capacity that had reached German hands was reduced to ashes in the room's metal waste bin. Why? Oster asked quietly. Why destroy the evidence? Because we cannot show them something they refuse to see, Canaris replied. And because possessing this film is more dangerous to us than ignorance is to them. They will survive in their delusions until reality destroys them. We will not survive if they discover we possess evidence that challenges their worldview. While Canaris and Oster grappled with unspeakable intelligence, One man within the Nazi hierarchy understood exactly what the Willow Run reports meant. Reichsminister Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and, since February 1942, Minister of Armaments and War Production. Unlike Göring, whose technical knowledge had atrophied into obsolescence, or Hitler, whose understanding of industrial production was entirely theoretical, Speer had spent 2 years reorganizing German war production. He understood factories, supply chains, labor productivity, and capital investment with professional precision. Speer had obtained the American intelligence through his own channels, not through Abwehr, but through contacts in German industry, who maintained relationships with neutral Swedish and Swiss industrialists. In May 1943, he received a comprehensive report from Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, head of Amt III, SD Inland, and a trained economist who understood production analysis. Ohlendorf's report, marked streng geheim, top secret, and delivered to Speer personally, rather than through official channels, contained devastating economic analysis. Herr Reichsminister, if the Willow Run production figures are even half accurate, Germany faces not military defeat, but industrial annihilation. The Americans are producing more aircraft in a month than we produce in a year. The capital investment they've made in a single plant, $200 million, exceeds our total aircraft industry investment from 1933 to 1941. The report continued with analysis that challenged every assumption of Nazi economic planning. The Americans have achieved productivity rates that our economic models considered impossible. They're producing each B-24 for approximately 137,000 after initial inefficiencies. Our equivalent aircraft, the Heinkel He-177, costs over 300,000 Reichsmarks, approximately $120,000 at current exchange rates, but requires 20,000 man-hours to produce versus Ford's 18,000 man-hours per B-24. The Americans are achieving better productivity despite higher wages, better working conditions, and significantly more complex aircraft. Ohlendorf concluded with economic calculation that transcended military analysis. The Ford Motor Company's peacetime production in 1941 was 1.1 million vehicles. They have converted a fraction of this capacity to bomber production. If they convert even 20% of American automotive capacity to military production, they will produce war material at rates that make Axis production irrelevant. By June 1944, based on current American production curves, they will have produced enough heavy bombers to deliver our entire 1940 London bombing tonnage every single day indefinitely. Speer's diary entry for May 15, 1943, discovered after the war in his personal papers, reveals his private despair. I have read Ohlendorf's analysis 3 times, checking his mathematics, questioning his assumptions. His conclusions are irrefutable. If the Willow Run figures are even half accurate, we face not defeat, but annihilation. The Americans produce more aircraft in a month than we do in a year, but I cannot speak this truth. To tell the Führer that American democracy has outproduced German National Socialism by such margins would be my death warrant. We are trapped in ideological certainty that mathematics has proven false, and speaking mathematical truth has become treasonous. Speer was trapped in an impossible position. As armaments minister, he understood Germany's production capacity precisely. He knew that in 1942, Germany had produced 15,288 military aircraft of all types: fighters, bombers, trainers, transports, reconnaissance. If Willow Run alone was producing 450 bombers monthly, that single plant was producing nearly 5,400 aircraft annually, 35% of Germany's entire aircraft production from one American facility producing one aircraft type. But Speer also understood that presenting this information to Hitler would accomplish nothing except his own removal, or worse. The Führer had already rejected the intelligence when Canaris presented it. Göring, whose Luftwaffe would be most affected by this production imbalance, had dismissed it as propaganda. The Nazi hierarchy had closed ranks around comfortable delusions, and anyone challenging those delusions would be eliminated as a defeatist or traitor. So Speer did the only thing he could. He attempted to increase German production through organizational improvements, while saying nothing about the fundamental impossibility of matching American capacity. He reorganized German aircraft production, achieving 25,527 aircraft in 1943, a 67% increase over 1942 that represented remarkable organizational achievement. He implemented rationalization programs, standardized components, improved supply chain efficiency, and extracted maximum output from available resources. But he also understood, privately, silently, that these improvements were meaningless against American industrial superiority. Germany was optimizing production within European paradigms, while Americans were inventing entirely new manufacturing methodologies that rendered European approaches obsolete. By December 1943, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive data showing American production projections for 1944. The numbers arrived through multiple channels: Swedish industrial contacts, Swiss banking sources, intercepted American logistics planning documents, even analysis of American newspaper reports that openly discussed production targets. The projections were staggering: B-24 Liberators, 18,000 units B-17 Flying Fortresses, 12,000 units B-29 Superfortresses, 1,000 units fighter aircraft, all types, 40,000 units total military aircraft, 96,000 units. For comparison, Germany's peak aircraft production would reach 39,807 units in 1944, less than half the American total, achieved while fighting on 3 fronts, suffering from strategic bombing, experiencing fuel shortages, and struggling with labor scarcity. When these projections reached Hitler on Christmas Eve 1943, his response was recorded by General Jodl in the Daily Situation conference log. The Americans claim they will produce more aircraft in 1944 than all nations have produced in all of history. It's absurd. It's mathematically impossible. It's propaganda designed to demoralize German forces. I will not adjust strategy based on American fantasies. 3 months later, reality would force entry through means even Hitler couldn't ignore. The skies over Germany would darken with bombers that ideology insisted couldn't exist.